for now. Please continue to have yourself muted. Please feel free to turn off your camera. Sometimes it's distracting for others to have a lot of faces up. We will be taking questions after each section. So let's go ahead and jump into our agenda. We're currently in our introduction portion. We will jump into the two different types of grants, the Real Property Investment Grant and the Job Creation Grant. And then we will do the CPA agreed upon procedures. That part of the presentation is specifically for CPAs to go over the procedures that they have to do when they are looking at these grants as part of their responsibilities. And after each of these sections, we will have a question and answer session where you can ask questions in the chat or out loud in your camera video. We do ask that you please hold your questions until that question and answer session. Please do not put them in the chat during the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. There are 45 enterprise zones throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia, from Zone 26, which includes Accomack and Northampton counties on the eastern shore, all the way to the other side of Virginia, with Zone 52, which is Wise County and Norton. And that is about 530 miles between those two zones. And as you can see, we cover a good part of the southern part of the state. Let's go ahead next and take a look at some of the data from our last grant cycle. That grant year was grant year 2023. There were 40 job creation grants issued, 140 real property investment grants, and those totaled to over $15.2 million in total awards. With those job creation grants, those business owners created 3,274 jobs for 82 average qualified jobs per firm. For those real property investment grants, over $293 million was invested by the businesses and leveraged for the grant money. And over $2.09 million was the average qualified real property investment amount per real property investment grant that was issued. Let's take a look at our program timeline. The Virginia Enterprise Zone program is a partnership between the state government and the local governments to encourage both job creation and private investment in those targeted areas and zones throughout the state by providing the two grants that we've mentioned, the Job Creation Grant and the Real Property Investment Grant. The program is subject to an annual appropriation by the Virginia General Assembly. The jobs must be created and improvements must be completed before a business or zone investor may receive that grant money. Job creation grants are funded at 100%, and then those remaining funds are allocated to the real property investment grants. So for this reason, the RPIGs are often prorated. However, in the last three grant years, grant year 2023, 2022, and 2021, there was no proration. Grant year 2020 had a proration amount of 88%. Our entire program is based on a calendar year, which is a little bit different than some of the other economic development programs or incentives, and that includes the procedures and documentation necessary for the grants. So in order for a project to be eligible for this upcoming grant year, which is grant year 2024, the final placed in service documentation must have been received or jobs must have been created in calendar year 2024. And we're going to go over that in more detail. All documents must be submitted via the EZ application submission portal. We are going to show you what that looks like. The submission deadline is at 11:59 p.m. April 1st, 2025. And all applications and the documents that are required with those applications must be submitted by the deadline to be considered on time. And just a side note, as you see in this picture, most all of the photos that are included in this presentation are our previous recipients of job creation grants and real property investment grants throughout the Commonwealth. This is what that application portal looks like. As you can see in the left-hand corner, you have all of the things that you need for the real property investment grant, including the manual for reference, a sample application page, the actual link to where you will submit, and then all of the required documents. And then the same goes for the job creation grant in that box in the middle, and then the CPA reports and manuals to the right at the bottom of the screen. And we're going to go in detail about how to submit and what all of those documents look like and what's required of those documents. Eligible property types. So there are two eligible property types for the Real Property Investment Grant. Zone investors must confirm first that the physical location of the property is within the boundaries of an enterprise zone. The way to do that is to contact the locality's local zone administrator. Normally, that local zone administrator is in the economic development department of the locality. Sometimes, if it's a smaller locality, it might actually be the county administrator or town manager themselves who are the local zone administrator. But if you talk to someone in economic development or higher up or within that office, they'll be able to tell you who the local zone administrator is, and they can look at their GIS and double check that the business is located physically within the boundaries of an enterprise zone. So there are two eligible property types, buildings and facilities. So first, let's talk about buildings and what the definition of that is in reference to our program. So a building is freestanding and unrelated in function. It has common ownership of real estate, but it's leased to tenants, and the owner has no say in the general management. So the tenants act independently of each other, and the owner does not dictate the hours of operation, any promotions, things like that. So an example of that would be the buildings that you see in this picture, a group of adjacent downtown buildings with one owner each. Even if these three buildings were owned by the same person, but they all had different business functions and operated completely separately, they would just be considered three separate buildings, even though they're physically attached. Another example would be just a regular freestanding building that has only one person or one business within it. And then we're going to move on to our next slide and talk about facilities. And that's when things get a little different and maybe a little bit more complicated, but we can work that out. A facility is a complex of buildings that are co-located at a single physical location. And that's not necessarily the same address or parcel. They may be two parcels right next to each other, and it could be two separate addresses that are right next to each other. And it has to have both of those buildings necessary to facilitate or conduct the same trade or business. So two of the checks that we do to see if something is a facility is whether it is co-located at a single physical location, it has related operations, and it's under common ownership and management. So that's three things in that too, but those are the three things that we look at. Common management and operations means that that group of buildings is designed to function as one unit, which requires unified operations from the tenants or the people who are utilizing it for business purposes, and that the management company dictates the hours of operation, your promotions, things like that. So a good example of this is a mall. We have a lot of malls in older malls in cities that are being converted into different uses. For a mall, all of those that are malls where you enter and exit through the same exit and entrance for all of the stores, that would be considered a facility because the management dictates the time that it can be opened and closed and promotions and things like that. Another example would be if you had a manufacturing facility, kind of like this picture, and one of the buildings is where the actual manufacturing takes place. Another one is a building for your equipment. Another one is your administration where you have your offices. That would be considered a facility. Eligible property uses. So the RPIG is available for rehabilitation, expansion, or new construction projects within those enterprise zone boundaries. The building or facility must be commercial, so that includes both office and retail. It can be industrial or it may be mixed use. For the purposes of the enterprise zone grant, to be considered mixed use, a building or facility must be at least 30% usable floor space devoted to commercial, office, or industrial use. And we're going to talk in more detail about mixed-use properties and the documents that are required for a mixed-use property. Eligible applicants. So we will be mainly referring to an applicant as a qualified zone investor or a zone investor. That's any entity or individual who is capitalizing on or expensing the costs associated with a real property investment. There are a couple of different kinds of zone investors. It can be a property owner. That can be someone who is an occupant or a non-occupant of the building. It may be multiple owners. In that case, the rights to that qualification should be coordinated with all the other owners of the property. We'll talk about that in more detail. It may be a tenant. So tenants that are making leasehold improvements can apply for the real property investment grant if they have the owner's permission, and only if the tenant is the one capitalizing on those improvements for tax purposes. If it is the landlord who is capitalizing on those improvements for tax purposes, even if it's benefiting the tenant, then the landlord would be the only one that could apply for the grant. And we'll talk about that in more detail as well. For developers, rights to, if you could go back, thanks, Mandy. Rights to the RPIG qualification should be reflected in the sale documents. If property has been sold, you do not have to maintain your ownership of the property to apply, but the first right for the grant goes to the current owner of the property. Eligibility requirements. So there is a minimum investment threshold based on construction type. Thresholds have to be met each year that an RPIG is applied for, and it does not carry over for the next year. The grant amount is 20% over the qualified real property investment amount over the respective eligibility threshold. The grant cap is based on the total qualified investment. If the qualified investment is less than $5 million in qualified investment, then there is a $100,000 maximum grant cap. If it's more than $5 million in qualified investment, then there is a $200,000 maximum grant cap. So let's take a look at these two boxes over to the right. For a new construction, the minimum threshold is $500,000 in qualified investments. So that means that for a new construction project, the zone investor would have to spend over $500,000 to qualify, and any qualified investment amount over the $500,000, we would take 20% of that to calculate the grant amount. That grant amount would be 20% of that. For a rehab or expansion, the minimum threshold is $100,000. And then we are also going to talk in more detail in future slides about solar. In 2019, there was a new legislation passed that allows for solar to be a part of an eligible qualified investment. For solar only, that means that it does not mean a solar farm, even though it might sound that way at first. It means that if solar is the only investment added to the property, to the building or the facility, then there is no threshold for qualification. If you have a new construction that includes solar as one of the investments, then the minimum threshold is decreased by 50,000. And so instead of that 500,000, it's 450,000. If you have a rehabilitation or expansion with solar, it's also decreased by 50,000. Instead of the 100,000, it would qualify at 50,000 in qualified investments. So let's talk about what those qualified investments are, what they mean, what's eligible and what's not eligible. So for the purposes of the real property investment grant, your qualified investments are your hard construction costs. That is any exterior, interior, structural, mechanical, or electrical improvements necessary to construct, expand, or rehabilitate a building for commercial, industrial, or mixed use. That includes excavations, grading and paving, installing driveways, and landscaping or land improvements. These are just a few examples. These are your things like carpentry, demolition, doors, windows, HVAC, plumbing, painting, roofing. We like to give the example that if you were to pick up the building and shake it, turn it upside down and shake it. If it falls out, it's probably not a qualified investment because it's probably not structural and attached to the building and permanent. If it stays intact, it probably is a qualified investment. And on page 13 of the Real Property Investment Manual, there's a very extensive list of what qualifies, and then the next page tells you what does not qualify. And if you have any questions about what qualifies and what does not, you can ask your CPA, you can refer to that manual, or you can also ask us if you can't find it in the manual. The next slide is looking at some of those ineligible costs. So those investments that are not eligible are your acquisition costs for the property or for the building and facility, any type of fees, any business personal property. A lot of times people ask us if something is considered real property or business personal property by us. The question is really, is it taxed in your locality as business personal property or real property? If it's taxed as real property, it probably will count as real property investment that's eligible for this grant. Closing costs, any furnishings, machinery and tools, those are all things that are not part of qualified investments for the state grant. Now, we did talk about at the beginning that it's a partnership between state and local government. So at your local level, with your local government, you may have eligible enterprise zone local incentives that do include things like machinery and tools. But for this state grant that we're talking about today, these are the ineligible costs. Calculating awards. So the dollar amount of a grant is based on that amount spent on your qualified real property investment, or your QRPI. Grant awards are 20% of the QRPI made in excess of the eligibility threshold. So of course, for that rehab or expansion, it's $100,000. For a new construction, it's $500,000. And grant award caps are based on the amount of investment. Grant awards are capped per building or facility over 5 years, and that's a 5-year consecutive term. And the first year of the 5 years is the grant year in which you receive the grant. So each company or zone investor can receive up to $100,000 per building or facility for QRPI of less than 5 million, and up to $200,000 for QRPI over 5 million. One question that we get that's pretty common is, let's say 1 year you're under 5 million, you're just under 5 million. So you don't qualify for the $5 million cap, and you receive a $100,000 award grant. And the next year you do more work and you still meet the investment threshold. Yes, you could qualify then for an additional $100,000, but you have to meet that investment threshold again and have all of the other documents and the final placed in service documents within the grant year. And we're going to talk about that more in future slides as well. Here's another example of award calculation and what that looks like. Let's look at that first column. So if you're doing a rehab or expansion and you have to have a minimum threshold of $100,000. So let's say that you have a project and you have a QRPI of $500,000. We're going to subtract that minimum threshold of $100,000 and you get $400,000 in grant eligible funds. We multiply that by the 20% grant amount and you get $80,000. For new construction, if you spend $1 million, we're going to subtract that $500,000 threshold. For a grant eligible amount of $500,000, you multiply that by your 20% and you get $100,000 grant. And then if you have a project that is a rehab or expansion and you spend $2 million, we subtract that $100,000 threshold for $1.9 million of the grant eligible as the grant eligible qualified investment. 20% is $380,000, but that exceeds the maximum grant amount for a rehab or expansion that's under 5 million. So you would only be eligible for the $100,000 because you don't go over the 5 million mark, and the zone investor would receive $100,000 in a grant amount. So this is a little bit more about that solar eligibility that I mentioned earlier. In 2019, the General Assembly voted to allow projects with solar components to qualify at those lower thresholds that we talked about. It lowers each threshold by $50,000. For a new construction with solar, the threshold was $2 changes from 500,000 to 450,000. For a rehab or expansion project with a solar, the threshold changes from 100,000 to 50,000. And then solar only improvements, so that means that solar is the only component added to the building or facility, qualify with no threshold required. So there's no minimum amount that has to be made in order to qualify. We also had new legislation that changed this year in 2024 that allows money for enterprise zone real property investment grants to include solar canopies for parking lots, like the ones that you see in these pictures. So it's the same as the other solar projects, but it includes those rooftop solar or solar canopies for parking lots as a qualified investment. Here is the chart with examples of how solar is calculated. So you have a new construction project with solar. You come in with a total qualified investment of $1 million. You subtract that threshold amount. If it wasn't a solar project, that threshold would be 500,000. But since solar is part of the project, the threshold is 450,000. And you have a grant eligible amount of 550,000. 20% of that is 110,000. That exceeds that maximum $100,000 grant amount, and the grant request could be a maximum of $100,000. For a rehab or expansion with solar, you have a total investment example of $100,000. Let's say that you subtract that $50,000 threshold, you would have a grant eligible amount of $50,000. 20% would be $10,000 as the grant request. And for a project that is solar only, so not a solar farm, but solar components were the only investment made to the building or the facility, you have a total investment of $75,000 as your example. There's no minimum threshold, so that threshold is zero. You have $75,000, we would take 20% of that for a $15,000 grant. This is just another way to illustrate all of those things that we've talked about in the last couple of slides. That first slide, bar on the left is rehab and expansion. 600,000 is your sweet spot to maximize the grant at 100,000, and your upper threshold to be to receive that $100,000 would be if you had 5 million. So once you get over 5 million, then you would be eligible for the $200,000 grant. The one on the right is for new construction with a minimum investment of 500,000. Your sweet spot to maximize the grant at 100,000 would be 1 million, because we would take 1 million and subtract that minimum investment. And then your upper threshold would be, again, 5 million for that additional $200,000 grant total. To be eligible for this upcoming grant year, a property must have been placed in service in calendar year 2024, which is January 1st, 2024 through December 31st, 2024. And a copy of the final placed in service document must be submitted with all of the RPIG applications. There are 3 types of final placed in service documents that we can accept. The first is that final certificate of occupancy from the locality. It cannot be a temporary or conditional certificate of occupancy. It has to be final. The same goes for that building inspection. Not all buildings or projects require a CO to complete the project. Some of them only require that building inspection. Again, it has to be final and not conditional or temporary. And if it is a case in which the locality did not require any permits for the work that had to be done. So an example of that would be if you did a major project doing asphalt in your parking lot. I don't think that that requires permits in a lot of localities. In that case, we could accept a final third-party inspection. And like I said, that's only acceptable if the project does not require any permits from the locality. Otherwise, we have to have something from the locality, either the final building inspection or the CO. So we used to have a form called Form Easy RPIG that you would fill out by hand and then upload into the system, and then you would upload the same information directly into the system. We no longer require the Form Easy RPIG. Instead, these are the required materials, and we're going to go over each of these individually. We have our Commonwealth of Virginia W-9, applicant declaration form, the local zone administrator review form, the placed in service documentation, supplemental forms, and that's when applicable, and then the CPA attestation report, which has to be submitted with the application and not after the deadline. So let's talk a little bit before we get into those actual documents. Let's talk about the responsibility of the RPIG applicant. The zone investor must provide the CPA with information to complete the online application and all the other required attachments. We do have a sample application on the page that can be downloaded and used for this purpose, but it's not required to be uploaded for the application itself. It's really important, though, to use that sample application page because the way our system works, you are not able to have a username and log in and work on the application, step away from it, save it, and come back to it. You have to submit everything all at once. You cannot save it and work on it gradually. So you want to use that sample application page to get all the information together, fill it out so that you can have it in front of you to submit into the system, and that you also have all of those documents that are required ready and able to upload into the system at the same time. The RPIG also needs to provide all the invoices and receipts for the qualified real property investments capitalized or expended by the zone investor and the final placed in service documentation issued for the completed qualified investments. The zone investor will also provide the CPA with the following. If it's a mixed use building, then the measured drawings for the building indicating the square footage and use of the building. For those applying as owners of space within a building, so for example, an office condo situation, then you would provide the closing documents or deed of trust indicating the building square footage. And for zone investors applying as tenants, the current lease agreement indicating the building's square footage must be provided by the RPIG applicant to the CPA. Here's a look at that Commonwealth of Virginia Form W-9 that is required. We do have to have this form. We cannot accept the federal form in place of it. So for this W-9 form, you must provide either a social security number or the federal employer identification number, the FEIN, in that box. The UEI is not required. You will provide an FEIN if the applicant is an LLC, a partnership, corporation, sole proprietorship, or an S Corp. And you will provide a social security number instead of an FEIN if the applicant is an individual. Every year, we have a lot of situations in which a company that is a disregarded entity is the one wanting to apply for the grant. Disregarded entity should never be checked as the taxpayer entity type on these W-9s or on our application. If the company that is applying for the grant is a disregarded entity, then the W-9 is submitted for the company or individual that is capitalizing on the investment. Very often that could be either an individual person, and in that case, you would use the social security number and the person's name as the legal name, or it could be a parent or taxable entity, and you would note the name of the disregarded entity on the form W-9 as the business name. There is a spot on the W-9 form for the remittance address. The remittance address is where you want to receive your check. So you will likely receive your check in the mail paper form. This address may be different than the physical or legal address of the company. The remittance address must be the address to which the company wants to receive the grant check. It's really important to make sure this is the correct address. We've had some companies not receive their check for a little bit of time because they put the wrong address there, and then we had to, cancel that check and issue a new one and go through that process. We don't want anyone to have to deal with that. So make sure that your remittance address is actually where you want to receive the check. If you already do business with the Commonwealth of Virginia, you may receive your payment through EFT, and all information must be completed on the COV W-9, even if that is the case. Our next form is the applicant declaration form. So you want to see those blue instructions to tell you the correct person to fill out each section. So that first section says to be completed by the zone investor or grant applicant. This is where you're going to put in your name, business name, contact phone, and email. the physical address of the property. When you're filling out that phone and email, it should be the main contact for the application or grant. A lot of times that's not necessarily the business owner. That might be the administrative person or the person who's in the financial office of the company that's dealing with this grant. This is the person that we're going to be in contact with if there's any issues with the grant, if we need to follow up and ask for additional information. There is a section for the narrative summary. This gives us a better idea and understanding of the project. And in that summary, you want to include any info on the state of the building or the facility before the project began. So you might want to tell us the building use and the owner. You want to give us a rough summary of the end goals or the work that was completed, and then a timeline of the project, or yes, a timeline of the project. That second section, as you can see in blue, is to be completed by the zone investor or the grant applicant or CPA. And that's where you're just checking off things to make sure that you've done everything correctly and you've met the correct threshold for the grant and the type of grant that you're applying for. This is the second page of that form. This is where your signature is required. And what you're signing is that you're declaring that you've made the management decisions necessary to complete the application, and it's been examined by you, and everything is correct and true and accurate. And you sign off on that. We can accept wet signatures on that. We can accept signatures that were signed by hand and scanned in. We do not want and we will not be accepting signatures that are generated by a computer or by Adobe. They need to be an actual signature, but you can scan those in. The next document is the LZA review form. That's for the local zone administrators. So the first part is filled in by the zone investor with all of that information. Again, your name, email, phone, physical address. One thing that we get a question about frequently is the property identification number. That is the number that's specific to each locality, and each locality might call it something different. Some call it a property identification number, some call it a tax ID number, a parcel number. You want to talk to someone in your locality about that to help you identify it if necessary. Usually you can look that up on your locality's website. The second half of the form must be completed by the local zone administrator, and the LZA certifies that the property is located within the boundaries of the enterprise zone. It must be signed by the LZA, and we will accept those electronic signatures that are scanned in, but we cannot have an LZA just type their name in the form or have that computer generated signature. So let's dive into that online application and what that looks like and how you fill it out. So we're going to go over each part right now, starting with the background information. So as I said earlier, Form Easy RPIG is no longer required to be uploaded. The same information is submitted online directly into the portal, as you can see here. And like I said, there's a sample application that's available for you to collect all that information so that you can have it prior to entering it into the system. And unfortunately, your application cannot be saved and must be submitted all at once. As you see here on the screen, part one is your background information. That's where you're going to put in the legal name of the zone investor, the type of zone investor, the FEIN or social security number, the physical address of the zone establishment, what type of property use it is, industrial, commercial, or mixed use, whether it's a building or facility, you will check that. The type of real property investment that was made. So was it a rehab of an existing facility or building, an expansion of an existing facility or building, new construction, solar only, rehab or expansion with solar, or a new construction with solar? And number 8 is where you will enter the information about the amount of square footage of the construction that was completed. So we want the amount of square footage of that building or that facility. This is for our purposes to know the general guesstimate of the amount of square footage that these grants are helping to make these projects happen throughout the Commonwealth each year. Number 9 is that property identification number, tax parcel number, whatever your locality may call it. 10 is where you're going to find the zone name and number and then the designation date will show up on its own, as well as the name of the local zone administrator. Once you have your LZA review form, you'll be able to see that zone name and number on there, because the LZA will enter that information for you. There are a couple of zones, or a couple of localities, excuse me, that have multiple zones, and so you just want to make sure that you're identifying that you're in the correct zone when you select number 10. The next part is the narrative summary. You can take that directly off that sample application that we looked at. And then also the grant applicant contact information. This is really important. It's the same information that we asked for on those other documents that we went over. One really great thing is that if you submit your grant, we have a certain amount of time in which we will review the grant, and we will look and see if there are any documents or information that's missing, anything that maybe wasn't signed or wasn't filled in correctly. We will work on it with you to make sure that it is updated and edited and is changed so that it has all of the information that we need. And so it's really important that this information for contacting the grant applicant is accurate and up to date, so that we can get in touch with you if we need something and we need you to change something in order for you to have your grant approved. Part 2 is all for your placed in service documentation. In Part A, you're going to select whether it was a certificate of occupancy, a final inspection, or a third-party inspector's report. And B is for you to explain if there are any differences in the name and the address listed on that final placed in service document from the name and address listed earlier on the application. So this could be related to a number of things. Maybe your business is known as one name, you're doing business as something, but your legal name that you're applying for for the application is different, and that's why they would look different. This is where you would explain that information. That final placed in service document must be dated within the current grant year. So that's grant year 2024. It has to be signed and dated in that grant year, and we cannot give grants for final placed in service documents that are from 2023 or from 2025. And the difference in the name and address listed on that final placed in service document from the name and address listed in Part 1, boxes 1 and 4. Yes, sorry, this is where we explain those differences. I'm just repeating something that I said earlier on this slide. Next section is the itemized list of those qualified real property investments. So this is what it looks like on the screen. You're going to go in there and list each type of investment. So you may have several companies that worked on electrical. You're going to list electrical as one thing and have the total amount of electrical over there in the column on the right. If you have more than the 20 that you can put here in the system, then you could upload an Excel sheet or a Word document with a list of the remaining items and the corresponding dollar amounts in the upload section of the application portal. Once you enter those amounts on the column on the right, they will automatically be totaled on the online portal for you. So you will get that total for you automatically. So here you can see that it took all of those. And when you upload an attachment, make sure that you save a line to put see attachment and put the total amount from that attachment on the dollar line, so that that can be automatically updated and part of the total qualified real property investment as well. Part 4 is qualification information. So you're going to put the date that the real property was placed in service. This is the date that's on that placed in service document. The qualification year is already there for you in the portal. It's 2024. The grant calculation, the first number 3A is auto-populated from that total that we just looked at of the qualified investments. That's the actual dollar amount of qualified real property investments made. B is the applicable investment threshold. based on the type of real property investment. So it's going to be different whether it's a new construction, a rehab, or expansion, and whether solar is a part of the investment. C is the amount of public grant funds received and used to fund those qualified real property investments. This is important. If you've received any grant funds at the local, state, or federal level for any of these investments that you're applying for, then those investments are not eligible for this grant. And that's why you have to put that amount there. If you put an amount in 3C, it's going to subtract that amount from your grant total earlier. Let's say that you have a project and you did receive public grant funds. If you choose not to put that as part of the investment, then and you already take that out, then you would just put 0 here in 3C because you've not included that in your total. D is the grant eligible dollar amount. E is where you would have your grant amount where you multiply by 20%. And then number 4, if you've received real property investment grants previously in the last 5 years, you enter that amount there because as we discussed earlier, in a 5 consecutive year period, you have a $100,000 maximum grant amount for investments under $5 million, and you have a $200,000 maximum grant amount for investments over $5 million. And then number 5 is your total requested grant amount. Let's take a look at part 5. That's the CPA's contact information. That's important when we reach out to you about any mistakes or anything that is needed to be corrected on your application. We will also include the CPA in that communication. Part 6 is the application information. You are going to check off the boxes that apply to your submission. If you were required to submit any of these supplemental forms in those situations, then you're going to check that off to make sure that you've done that and you have all the necessary forms. The next section is where you upload your document. So as you can see, there are specific places where you would upload your placed in service document. You choose that file from your computer and you save it. You do that with your CPA attestation report form, that Commonwealth of Virginia W-9, your applicant declaration form, and your LZA review form. Those are all documents with those red asterisks that are required of every RPIG applicant. And then the rest of those listed there are your supplemental forms that may be required if you have a multiple owner, tenant owner consent, tenant coordination, or mixed use property. Some important notices are that we are not accepting password protected documents. All documents must be uploaded separately. You cannot scan all of these documents and save them as one PDF and give us that as the uploaded requirement. You have to submit each one separately so that we have those saved. I know that might seem like not a big deal, but if you're going through a couple hundred applications, 150 applications in a very short amount of time, then it makes things really hard when you have to take time to take all of those documents apart and resave them. So we appreciate you submitting them all separately. The last little checkbox, it's really tiny on this screen. It says check to make sure that the COV W-9 has the correct FEIN and that the remittance address is the correct address to which the department will send the company's grant check. And you check that off just to make sure one last time that you have the correct information there, because that's really important for getting your grant money. So one of the last things we're going to go over for the real property investment grant is the supplemental forms that are required. I'm not going to name them all right now because we're going to go over each of them individually in the next slides. For mixed use buildings, Form EZ RPIG mixed use verifies that at least 30% of usable square footage in the building is commercial, office, or industrial use. That is the requirement in order to be eligible for the RPIG. If there are common areas that are accessible to the commercial space, this can be counted toward the commercial square footage. So if you have a conference room or a lounge that is used, that can be part of the square footage for the commercial space. Form EZRPIG mixed use must be completed by the preparer of the measured drawings or plans for work done to the reference building. The preparer of plans must be a licensed third-party architect, surveyor, or draftsperson, and the CPA will review the status of the license during the attestation process. So this is a document that you're going to have and give this information to your CPA, and a document that you will also upload into our system so that we can verify that that mixed-use building is 30% usable square footage that's commercial, office, or industrial use. Grant coordination. So there are some supplemental forms necessary to ensure that the grant caps are not exceeded by a zone investor. If owners and tenants do not coordinate, DHCD will determine the maximum grant amount available based on that cumulative amount of real property investment made to the property or proportion of square footage leased or owned by the zone investor. So if the applicant is the tenant, then leasehold improvements made directly by the tenant are eligible. If the tenant has improvements made by the landlord or the owner under a capital lease, then the tenant could be the applicant. And the landlord or the owner must be the applicant if the improvements are paid for by the landowner as part of an operating lease. So remember, when you're trying to figure out who the applicant is, it is who made those improvements and are putting those improvements, capitalizing on those improvements for tax purposes. Let's go over a couple of the common errors that we receive every year. The first is placed in service documentation is not final or indicates pending work or a failed inspection. So the zone investor has to apply for the grant year associated with the calendar year of their final documentation. So for instance, if you got a placed in service document, a final inspection in December of 2024, but it said that it still has pending work, we're not going to be able to approve your grant because we don't have a final placed in service in 2024. Let's say you got that work finished, but it wasn't until January of 2025, and that's when you get your final placed in service. You would have to wait to apply for grant year 2025. So error 2 says a placed in service document for consecutive phases of a project were received in a different calendar year. So again, your eligibility is based on the calendar year that each CO was received, and therefore each CO would require separate applications. Not only that, but it would also require meeting those threshold amounts each time that you apply for a different grant year. If multiple phases of work were completed on a single building or facility within the same calendar year, you must only meet the minimum investment threshold once because it's the same calendar year. But if it's 2 separate calendar years, then it would need to be met both times for both grant applications. I think we have another slide with common errors. Error 3, application spans multiple addresses, so a facility, but the CO only references one address. Zone investors can apply only for work covered under the placed in service document. So if the work covered multiple addresses, then we would need to see those multiple addresses listed on one CO, or we would need to see multiple COs that cover each address to reflect all of them. And that should be noted in part 2 of that online application. Error 4, differences in address entered from one year to another. So this is if you have applied for a real property investment grant in the past. Please make sure that the physical address is written and typed. It's not written, sorry, it's typed in the same as in previous RPIG applications. Our system is really picky about how you put in those addresses. So if before you put in north and you typed it out rather than just in period, or you typed out street instead of the abbreviation of ST, please try to remember how you applied in the past. And if you don't remember, just reach out to either Mandy or myself, and we'll be happy to give you the exact way that you applied in the past so that we can make sure that the system has you filed correctly and that the grant cap is not exceeded due to any errors or confusion with addresses. Error 5 is properties improperly identified as buildings instead of a facility. And grants are capped per building or facility, so the property must be correctly identified so that applicable grant caps are not exceeded. Very often we are contacted about this question, and we can help work through it to help you figure out whether it's a building or facility. If any time there are major situations in which grant caps were exceeded due to an error on the part of the grantee, then grant awards have to be repaid back to the Commonwealth. But like I said, once we're reviewing those grants, we have time to review them and to see what needs to be changed. And it's our job and our hope to help you get everything together that you need to make sure that that grant is correct and that we can approve it for you to make sure that you have all the information that you need submitted. Error 6, vague or conditional items listed on the schedule of qualified real property investments. So we ask that you break down and individually list the investments. One that we constantly see is site work. So instead of just listing site work, we need to know what that site work was, because sometimes there are types of site work that are listed that are not eligible investments. And although a lot of them are, we need to see those so that we can double check that those are eligible investments. Error 7 is a lack of detail when including conditional items. So there is a list of conditional items in the manual that can be looked at and referenced. Instead of listing change orders, we need to know exactly what that change order was. So the example would be listing additional flooring work instead of just change orders, so that we can make sure it's a qualified investment. So that was a lot of information for you about the Real Property Investment Grant. And now is your time to ask questions. Please feel free to put those in the chat right now. You can also use the raise hand function. If you look at the top of your screen, there is a hand that says raise. If you click on that, we will be notified and we can call on you. So what questions do you have this time, at this time, about the Real Property Investment Grant? Not, oh, I see one. Okay, I'm going to call on Craig and then I'll go to Sean's question in the chat. So Craig, you're up next. Please unmute yourself and feel free to ask your question.
Thank you, Kate. I'm in Roanoke, Virginia. Uh, Partners and myself developed a medical office complex with a number of buildings all on one parcel. Have communicated and talked with Tori and Mandy in the past about it. The question I have is, we had a situation where one of the buildings um, received a temporary CO in 23. We had a final building inspection to allow occupancy of the building in 23. I believe it was October or November of 23. The final CO was not issued until 24, early 24, due to a number of items that they wanted completed before they would actually do a CO, but we had the final that gave a temporary. So when you say a final inspection or a CO, that would qualify. Is that correct? Because they did have a final building inspection that was granted, and then the CO was a temporary. The project was an assembly of buildings, and one of the other buildings was not completed, so part of the CO was not granted because the landscaping was not in. But they gave a temporary for occupancy because the landscaping was not an issue that was a life safety issue. So they went ahead and let the building be occupied under a temporary CO with a final building inspection. But the final CO was not granted until early 24. So
Sure.
my question would be, would that qualify for a 24 applicant?
So from what you're explaining and from the information that you gave, it sounds like it would qualify. I would love to talk to you offline and look at those documents with you virtually and double check that to make sure though.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. I see a question from Sean Middleton in the chat that says, can you speak to the treatment of tenant reimbursed expenses or insurance claims? I actually probably might need the expertise of Tori to help me out with this one. This is not one that we deal with very often. I have never dealt with insurance claims before, and I am honestly not sure about that.
It's a good question. So for insurance claims, those we cannot count insurance claim reimbursements for because it's really not new investments. You're getting reimbursed for those investments, so they're not really capitalizing those expenses. If there were maybe additional expenses outside of the reimbursements that you're getting from the insurance claim that may be possible. So, I mean, if you have a specific client that you're working with on that that type of situation, please feel free to reach out to us and we can kind of go through it and see what may or may not be eligible for the enterprise zone grant.
Thanks, Tori. Perfect. Thanks, Sean. You know where to find us if you have other questions. What other questions do other folks have at this time before we jump into the job creation grant? I see another one, Elizabeth. We'll do Elizabeth and then the next person.
Hi. We never gave up occupancy of our building while the renovations were being done, so we don't have a certificate of occupancy for this issue. We were told we don't need one because we never gave up occupancy.
Sure. So if permits were required by the locality, then instead of the certificate of occupancy, did you receive a final inspection?
Yes.
Then that would be your final placed in service document, the final inspection instead of the CO.
Okay. And I have one other question, which
Sure.
I hopefully isn't a stupid question, but just given what's going on this week, this is all state and local funds and not affected by the federal government and decisions that they're making right now.
Yes, that's right. All of our enterprise zone funds are appropriated by the Virginia General Assembly when they do their budget each year. So yes,
Okay.
that's
Thank you.
not a stupid question at all. It's a great question. All right, our next person with their hand up, Adam.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, thanks for hosting this. So we built a mixed-use condominium with I think 35% of it was commercial, and we kind of delivered a shell space to the commercial tenant, and they did their own upfit from there. Would that tenant who spent money on that outfit be eligible for the enterprise zone grant too?
Yes, if the tenant, so there's a couple of things that would affect that. So first off, the tenant would have to meet the minimum investment amount. Second off, it would depend on how much you're applying for your grant. So the tenant and the owner combined can only get the maximum grant amount. And you all can work that out on your own. That's what we hope for. But in the case of a tenant and an owner, the first person we would issue the grant to would be the owner. They have the first I'm losing words, the first opportunity for the grant instead of the tenant since they're the owner. But let's say that you both invested over the minimum threshold amount and you were applying as the owner for a grant of 75,000 and they also invested over the minimum investment amount and they wanted to apply for 25,000. That would be under the $100,000 maximum and that would be eligible for both parties.
Okay, and so would we file one application, because I think our combined expenses would have been over 5 million. Would we apply? I'm sorry.
It would have to be two applications because because you have two different investors who are capitalizing on the investments for tax purposes. So it would be two separate, and you both would have to have your supplemental forms for splitting up that grant and for the grant coordination. And this is another somewhat complicated situation. And Mandy and I are happy to meet with you virtually and talk to you all and tell you, which documents you need and how we can help you work through that too.
That'd be great. Thank you so much, Catherine.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? I think we probably need to go ahead and move forward to the job creation portion. And I am going to turn the speaking over to Mandy now.
Thanks, Kate, and I will hopefully keep my fingers going in the correct direction to change slides. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the job creation grant. A lot of the slides are going to be the same with the application portal and some other aspects. So we will try to keep it as brief as possible while still giving you the correct information. So again, of course, submission deadline is April 1st, 2025 at 11:59 p.m. We do, of course, tell you that we'll have support for you, but only till 5 o'clock. So make sure you get those in on that day, or if you have questions, you ask us before that April 1st deadline. Again, a copy of the application portal system and the job creation information is all in that middle box. And then, of course, the CPA information to the right. We're going to get into the summary qualifications for the job creation grant, but just to review them, of course, the company does have to be located within the enterprise zone boundaries that created those jobs. The positions do have to be full-time and permanent. They cannot be temporary or seasonal employment. They must be new positions to Virginia. They cannot be churned from other localities within Virginia. There is a 4-job threshold to qualify for the grant itself, so the grants do not kick in until that 5th position. The company must offer to pay at least 50% of the health insurance premiums, and there are minimum wage requirements based off of the Virginia minimum wage that do pay above that amount. So we'll go over these. Again, just to remind you, the job creation grant, in order for your company to apply, you must be located within the enterprise zone. They are permanent full-time positions. They also must be of indefinite duration. So they cannot be temporary positions for a certain amount of time. They must be hired for, or jobs created, positions created for an infinite amount of time. The employees do have a report to work requirement within the zone on a regular basis. They must report to work at least once per month. We know this may have changed some over the past few years based off of different telework options. And then positions do have to normally be scheduled to work at least a minimum of 35 hours per week for at least 48 weeks. A minimum of 35 hours per week for the portion of taxable year in which the employee was hired, or a minimum of 1,680 hours per year if standard fringe benefits are part of the package. Again, these are net new positions to Virginia. They cannot be moved from one location in Virginia to another. And the new or existing businesses who created grant eligible jobs over a base year employment levels. So what is a base year? The base year is either of the 2 calendar years preceding this current grant year. So again, we're talking about the grant positions that were created during 2024, which is January 1st to December 31st. So a company can use a base year of 2022 or 2023. New businesses will likely have a base year employment of 0 just because they are new to Virginia or they're a new business that has been created. And again, you must meet that minimum 4-job threshold to qualify, and the grants kick in on that 5th position. Other information to qualify for the job creation grant: the business, of course, pays at least 50% of that eligible employee's health insurance. The employee does not have to accept the health insurance. It can be waived. However, it must be part of the company's standard benefit package. There are minimum wage requirements to meet, which we'll review in a future slide. And there are some positions that are restricted and are not allowed to apply for the job creation grant. And those do include personal service, food and beverage, retail, restaurant, units of government, and nonprofits, except for those NAICS codes that are listed there. So I'll be showing you on the application portal, but there is a place that the business must put their NAICS code to make sure that those applicants are eligible. And there is in our job creation grant manual, which is of course located on the portal as well, there's a more extensive list of the businesses, or not businesses themselves, but industries based off of the NAICS codes and what is eligible and ineligible positions. So to talk a little bit about those minimum wage requirements, the minimum wage for this grant cycle is based off of the minimum wage in Virginia on December 1st of 2023, which was $12 per hour. And we do want these jobs that are created to be prevailing wages. And so there is a minimum threshold associated with that wage in order to be able to receive that grant. So all businesses are eligible to apply for if they have positions that pay at least $21 per hour or 175% of that minimum wage based off of $12 per hour. They're eligible for up to $800 per permanent full-time position. Additionally, businesses with paying 150% or $18 per hour are eligible to apply for up to a $500 grant. And then there is also legislation that talks about or that allows high unemployment areas and also SWAM certified businesses to be able to apply at that lower wage threshold of 125% or $15 per hour, which would allow them to go ahead and apply up to the $500 grant. Please keep in mind that the minimum wage has been changing in Virginia over the past few years, and so new minimum wage requirements may affect grantees. So positions that were eligible in the past, if they have not been receiving wage rate increases or to meet those new wage rate thresholds, that position may be ineligible. Here's just a snapshot of those high unemployment areas for 2024. They're eligible for their job creation grant to apply at the 125% minimum wage. For 2024, it is Brunswick County, both zones 1 and 57 in Danville, Dickinson County, the city of Emporia, the city of Hopewell, and the city of Petersburg. Please note that a few of those zones do have joint zones, and those joint zones are not automatically eligible. Also, if an existing business has applied in previous years for the job creation grant as a high unemployment area, they are allowed to continue applying at the 125% wage rate for the remainder of that 5-year grant period. Any new businesses applying for the job creation grant in these zones, they must pay at least 125% of the minimum wage. So this does change on a yearly basis. A lot of them stay the same, but some of them do change. So if we had, and I don't have the 2023 right in front of me, but if your company or you had a company in your locality that applied in 2023 and you were a high unemployment area, they'll be able to continue applying for that during that 5-year cycle as a HUA or high unemployment area business for their job creation grant. As we mentioned before, or as I mentioned briefly, in 2021, legislation allowed for SWAM, that's small women and or minority-owned businesses, to also be allowed to apply for the grant that is anywhere in Virginia if they are SWAM certified at that lower wage threshold of 125%. They must, in order to be eligible, they must have been SWAM certified and approved at some point in calendar year 2024 or before. And on the application itself, we do ask that you make sure you check that it's a SWAM certified business that's applying. And you also would need to use that job creation high employment area or SWAM certified worksheet. And we'll talk about that worksheet on some future slides. So what is the application process? The exact same as the real property investment grant. The applications are being accepted now for the grant year 2024 from businesses that increased employment over their base year by at least that 4-job threshold. And that's for jobs created, again, January 1st to December 31st. We do want to talk really briefly, and we'll go into this more, the CPA attestation. All job creation grants are required to have a CPA attestation unless the applicant has a base year employment of less than or equal to 100 permanent full-time positions, and they created grant eligible positions of less than or equal to 25 permanent full-time positions. And please note this is a slight change from last year. So how do you calculate your award? This is a simple look at it. So this is a very simple way for you to look at it in your mind to determine what that potential grant eligibility will be. But we've got a spreadsheet that you do or worksheet that you must fill out for every job creation grant. But really quickly, so if your base year employment in 2023 was you had 10 permanent full-time positions, and during 2024, you had 35 permanent full-time positions. And I do want to mention that the job creation grant does work with, it's position based, but it's about an employee filling that position. Okay. So we say that it's a position, but you do during the process of filling out the information, all the employees' information is provided, start dates, end dates to make sure that position was filled. So the grant year, you had 35 permanent full-time equivalent positions, and all of us, for this sake, we're going to say they all earned 150% or $18 per hour, and they were all employed for the entire year, January 1st to December 31st. And everyone qualified because the company offered to pay at least 50% of their insurance premium. So the calculation would start with that 35 grant year employees. You're going to subtract your 10 base year employees. Then you're going to subtract your 4 job threshold requirement, which equals 21 grant eligible positions. If you multiply that by $500, because they're making the 150%, by 21, the job creation grant award would be up to $10,500. What is the grant term? The grant term actually is 5 years as long as the company is maintaining or increasing employment over that first year application and over the base year. So the first year of the 5-year grant period is the first year of grant eligibility. After the first 5-year grant period, possible qualification for subsequent grant periods if the company is still creating jobs that are eligible. So there's guidelines associated with what that new base year would be for a company who does apply for subsequent grant years. The job creation grant worksheet. So this is the worksheet that all businesses must fill out in completion with the employee information to talk about the positions being filled. It is a worksheet that has locked columns, special formulas, hidden cells, and so we ask you to fill it out from left to right, line by line. And this is a screenshot, an example of the worksheet. There are 2 different worksheets. Keep in mind, there's one if you are the job creation grant, but if you're going to be applying because you are HUA area, high unemployment area, or you are a SWAM certified business, you want to make sure you're using the JCG HUA SWAM certified worksheet. And it will have an extra column over there on the right to allow for the additional wage rate. So if you're filling this out left to right, the employee, you're going to complete the first employee, and then you're also the next column is for the CPA through the attestation procedure. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. And you're going to complete this with the employees' names for those employees during the base year first in alphabetical order. And so if you take a look at this worksheet, we've completed it with our last names being in alphabetical order. And then you also need to complete the either 4 digits of social security number or employer. Sometimes employees are issued a number. It's fine if you want to use the last 4 digits of that. We have no problem with that. The cell or the worksheet itself is actually set for the blocks to go red if it senses any potential errors. So you'll see on here, we've got Patrick Henry on line 2, where his employee numbers are 2222. And you'll also see Thomas Jefferson on line 5, that his last 4 digits are 2222. That's not a problem. It's fine to leave those in red, but it's just bringing attention to you as the completer of the worksheet that there could potentially be an issue. And you'll see that maybe with Henry Lee III on lines 10 and 11. Well, Henry is actually the same person, but he was entered twice because he had a wage rate change. So going back up to the top, you're going to complete it left to right. Because those are base year employees, it's going to automatically black out the hourly wage rate. You're not going to enter that. So you're going to complete all of the columns that allow you to enter data. That includes the first work date in the base year, last work date. And if that employee worked during the base year, you would also include them or if the base year employee worked during that grant year, you're also going to put their work dates in there as well. And please be sure to remember to mark yes that they receive the benefits. You'll notice down there on line 13 that John Page was not offered benefits for some reason, and so he is not a grant eligible position. This information is going to feed onto worksheet 2, and that worksheet 2 is where all of your calculations are going to come from to determine your grant eligibility amount. Okay, so this is going to be information that will actually be you'll input directly into the application portal or your sample application as well when you're working on it. So that's why it says form reference, part 2 4A, part 2 4B. That's telling you where that number is going to go on the application itself. So on the job creation grant worksheet, it does need to be completed for net new positions earning at least $18 per hour. The worksheets are completed for positions earning at least $15 per hour as well. The worksheets will calculate grant eligible positions filled during the grant year, and it will automatically calculate qualification information to be used for that job creation online form. Based on the dates of employments, the worksheet will automatically distribute full months worked at each eligible wage rate. So if a position was not filled for the entire grant year, the prorated amount based on the number of months employed is automatically calculated. And that says number of months, but if I remember correctly, I think it's even days that position is filled. So that's why we always say you may receive up to $500 or $800 per position, because it depends on how many days that position was filled by an employee. A little bit more about the worksheet. You do want to include all employees filling permanent full-time positions during the base year and grant year. You do not include positions that are not permanent, so those contracted or seasonal work. Part-time, do not include employees that are part-time or as needed. Do not include employees that do not meet the report to work requirement. And you do not include food and beverage employees, retail, or personnel. And the wage info only needs to be listed for permanent full-time positions hired after the base year through 12/31/24 that have been offered the health benefits. Please, as a reminder, if an employee is given a raise during the grant year, they must be put on separate lines indicating that wage rate. You cannot average them together. Somebody who is on salary is allowed to be included on that or as a eligible position. If they are, you're going to want to divide an employee's annual salary by 1,820. Now, keep in mind that the eligibility criteria for that salary employee is that they've worked at least 1,680 hours to qualify. But this is just a sample of the calculation, which is the conversion rate to determine their hourly rate, because the hourly rate is the amount that does have to be put on that worksheet. So if an annual salary of $40,000 is divided by the 1,820, then, and we got that by 52 weeks times 35 hours a week, which is the minimum number of hours to work, and divide that out, is at 21.98. It was actually 21.97 something per hour. Also, be sure you can include shift premiums and commissions for employees, but you do not include bonuses or overtime. This is just information. The worksheet itself does have 3 tabs. On the 3rd tab, it does have how to print that worksheet if for some reason you do want a hard copy. Be sure to follow those directions because the worksheet has over 3,000 rows, and I don't think everyone wants to print all of that. What are the required materials for the job creation grant? Lots of similar materials for the RPIG grant. We're going to go over those. Again, April 1st, 2025 is that deadline. Before we get into those required documents, the job creation grant applicant responsibilities does have applicant responsibilities to the CPA for that attestation process if it's required. The grant the grant applicant should have completed their worksheet to include all the employees based off of the criteria provided. And so all of that can be found in the job creation grant manual as well. If you have questions in the future, or you're welcome to reach out to us. Make sure that if employees receive raises, that is indicated to the CPA performing the attestation. I also say that if the CPA asks for information, just give that to them, because they're trying to help you be able to apply for this grant as well. You are going to be pulling I-9s, pay stub, payroll records, and indicating the first work date and last work date and any wage rate changes so that the CPA can review those. Health benefit documentation, including benefit waivers. We have had a few questions in the past because some companies have been going to like an online acceptance portal. And so there is ways to take a look at that. If it's in the manual that it's the wage rate is being offered, or I'm sorry, the health benefits are being offered, but they're not being subtracted from the employee's payroll records, or they are on the payroll records. So there are some ways to take a look at if for some reason your company has gone to an online portal system that you do not necessarily get a printout associated with a waiver form. Those are individual bases that we can take a look at. And of course, the business firm representative must provide his or her signature on the declaration, verifying that no retail, food or beverage, or personal service positions are listed on the worksheet. All the positions are permanent full-time and have not been churned from other locations, and that every employee meets the report to work requirement. This is just a repeat of the Commonwealth of Virginia W-9 that Kate reviewed earlier. The saying goes that you must put the Social Security number or the FEIN. Please do not check disregarded entity, because we will have to send it back to you. And then, of course, make sure that you're using the legal and business name of the company. The remittance address must be completed. We do recommend that even if it's the remittance address is the same as the legal address, you either complete it in full or at least put same as legal address, so that there is no question that that's where the check will go. The applicant declaration form. So Kate reviewed this, all the same information. If your company is applying for both a real property investment grant and a job creation grant, you do need only to complete this form once, but they are separate applications. So you will have to upload the local zone administrator form and the applicant declaration form each time. So while it only has to be completed once, it does have to be uploaded for each application. And for the sake of time, I am just skipping a few of these things since Kate did review those earlier. Make sure that if you're completing this as a job creation grant applicant, that you are going under there, the job creation grant worksheet box, and checking the appropriate lines on that. Again, the local zone administrator review form, we still do want the property ID number, even though it's not the real property investment grant. We all applications do require that, whether it's an RPIG or JCG. So make sure you're getting that information from your local zone administrator to be able to include. And then we're going to go into the application portal itself, which is very similar to the real property investment grant with a few different changes. So again, there used to be a JCG form, application form that was required to be uploaded with the application or submitted. That is no longer required, but there is the sample application that we encourage you to print out or download and complete, or use it as your method to collect your information. Because again, you cannot save this application and come back to it at a later time. So that will allow a few things. It allows you to collect your information over time. It also allows you to provide your CPA with all the information so they can perform the attestation appropriately. Make sure, so again, number one, zone investor's name, legal name, the date the business started. Under a job creation grant, the activity code is required, which is the NAICS code. So you're going to pull that down, take a look, most people, I recommend that if you are not sure what that is, you either talk to your CPA or you look at your last tax returns. It's usually on there. Be sure that you indicate which type of application this is. Is it a standard job creation grant application? Are you applying under the high unemployment area, or are you applying under the SWAM certified business? And again, all the other information is similar or the same as the real property investment grant. So once you get into part 2 of the qualification information, the grant year, of course, is going to be 2024, but checking your year of qualification. Again, we mentioned earlier under the job creation grant, as long as you are maintaining or increasing jobs over the base year employment, you're allowed to apply for the grant for up to 5 years. So if you applied in 2023 and now it's 2024, you're actually going to be applying in year 2 of qualification. Again, this base year, number 3, that number is not going to change over the years over that 5-year grant eligibility period. If you're a new applicant for year 1 in 2024, your base year can either be 2022 or 2023, but not before that. And then on that worksheet where I had stated earlier that the worksheet 2, all of those numbers are going to be carried over and entered into the application portal. This is where that happens. So some of these boxes are auto-calculated after you've entered some of those numbers, and then some of them, of course, you need to enter. So you're going to have to enter the 4A and the 4B, and then other numbers are going to be calculated for you. But follow the directions based off of the application itself. And again, all of this is on the sample application, so you can work that out ahead of time. These are just 2 looks. The reason it's very important for you to choose that standard application or whether you're a high unemployment or SWAM is because the application portal itself will automatically determine that you're applying under that so that it will understand if you're able to apply, if you'll see under that 5F, if you're able to apply for that 125%. Again, follow the directions from the worksheet on the second page of the worksheet, entering those numbers, and so then that way you'll be able to do your grant calculation. And again, we have a small checkbox under number 7 where you are again attesting to the fact that these are not retail food or beverage positions, personal service positions. The all employees are listed as permanent full-time and not churned from somewhere else within the Commonwealth, and that all employees do meet the report to work requirement. Under part 3 and the CPA information, you are going to want to put the CPA that's performing the attestation, because again, we are going to be, if something is amiss, we are missing some documentation, we have the ability to reach out to the person that's listed as the contact person, and we're also going to contact the CPA if there is one in order to be able to ask those questions. Now, if you do meet the attestation exemption requirements, then you would just put exempt under the name of the certified public accountant. And if you have questions about that after you've completed the worksheet itself, then you can reach out to our staff. Again, you're going to have an area to upload those documents. All the STAR documents are required, and they must not, you cannot have them password protected, and they must be uploaded separately because, as Kate stated earlier, we're going through a couple hundred applications. We're are thankful if we can have those all individually so we can review them on an individual basis. And your JCG worksheet, just as a reminder, should be uploaded as an Excel document. You should not save that as a PDF to upload. It should be uploaded as the Excel version. So just as a reminder for the CPA attestation for the job creation grant, so the attestation requirement is waived if a firm has the base year employment of 100 or fewer positions and creates 25 or fewer grant eligible positions. The waiver eligibility must be determined each year. So if a firm applied in year 1 of their 5-year cycle and they met this requirement or were under these guidelines, and they were exempt from the attestation, that does not automatically mean they are exempt for the 5-year period. They would then have to complete the worksheet each year if they continue to add positions, and that eligibility is determined on a year-by-year basis. So all firms must still complete the job creation grant worksheet, even if they are exempt from the attestation, because we will be reviewing that. And the DHCD staff will monitor each firm who was able to waive that attestation annually using the procedures outlined in our attestation manual. So that was a lot of information very quickly. Again, we know that we're giving you plenty to think about at this time. We do have a little bit more, another section to go over, which is the CP attestation portion. But before we do that, we do want to give an opportunity to ask questions. So if you just want to put those in the chat or raise your hand. And I think I saw one in the chat. So Emily, can you discuss how to treat employees that aren't benefit eligible until a required minimum employment period, and whether or not they can be included in the JCG worksheet for their full employment? So basically pre-benefits or only the period in which they met the benefits eligibility. That is a great question, Emily, that I'm not sure I actually reviewed or addressed. So yes, if the employee, for example, your company says that benefits or the health insurance benefits are not eligible for 90 days after the employee starts day one. As long as that employee is offered those health benefits, but they don't kick in until that 90-day period, they can be included from that first day of work. So if I started January 1st, but my benefits are not going to kick in until March 1st, then yes, I can still be, as long as, again, it's in the manual, or there is documentation associated with the fact that we hired you, however, your benefits don't start for 90 days, then they still can be included in that job creation grant worksheet. And Tori, if you have anything to add, please feel free to.
Yeah, that's right. Just one caveat to that. So if, let's say those don't kick in until after 90 days, if that employee does not work that full 90 days, so was never offered those, the ability to have those benefits, then you do not count that employee for the time that they were there. So they would have had to have received those benefits to be able to count them as a grant eligible employee.
Thank you. So Melinda, for year 2, would you leave 2023 employees off the worksheet? Melinda, I may need a little bit more information, but I think you are, yeah, do you mind unmuting and asking that question?
Absolutely. I'm just looking at, excuse me, last year's worksheet, and I think I've answered my own question. So our base year was 2021, and last year was our first year. And
Okay.
so this will be our second year. So we're just going to send in our first year employees as our base on the worksheet itself. And then we'll just enter in our 2024 employees on the worksheet, correct?
No. You would not need to include the base year employees, the 2021 employees, but because you may have some employees that are still working there from. No, you include everybody on that, so you would have the same 2021 would still be your base year employees. You would include 2024 employees, so those could be some people that worked in 2023, but you would only say the dates that they worked in 2024.
Okay.
So your base year employees don't change. So if you listed those, you said 2021, those 2021 employees listed on the worksheet do not change. You're going to enter the exact same information. And then you would list employees that worked during 2024. So you may have had somebody that only worked a few days during 2023 and they were on your worksheet last year. They're not necessarily going to be on there. So like Tori said, you're going to include just that 2024 employees that worked during that 2024 time period. And I'd be happy. I know that we have had other conversations. We can talk offline if you have more.
I would absolutely appreciate that. I greatly appreciate that. Yeah, it's very confusing doing second year too, as well as it was first year. So thank you so much.
Well, and it's not, I mean, we're showing you this worksheet that takes time to go through. And
It does. Thank you.
You're welcome. Paul, I see your hand. Would you like to unmute and ask?
Yeah, follow up to Tori's point on the benefits eligibility after a certain amount of time. If we have an employee that was hired, say, December 15th, and we don't know if they're going to meet the eligibility requirements at the time of the application until sometime in 2025, what would you recommend doing in those instances? Do they include them? Do they exclude them if they know they've met it? It seems like a gray area there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they can go ahead and include them, even though they don't know, if they're going to make that full 90-day period, because you're at the end of the year. So I think that's fine to go ahead and include those from the date that they were hired in 2024.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions about the job creation grant portion? All
I have
right.
put a link in the chat for the application portal. On that link, you can find all of the documents, the manuals. That's where you will submit your grant. I also put in, that's up on the screen, the link to the general email account, which is ezone@dhcd.virginiaspelledout.gov. The next portion of the presentation is specifically for CPAs. If this is your first time applying and you are not a CPA and you watch this part of the presentation, it might confuse you. It's not information that you necessarily need. We're going over the procedures that the CPAs have to do for their part of the grant. So if you're not a CPA, we say thank you so much for coming and for listening, and please feel free to reach out to us via email. We will answer your questions and help you as much as we can. And you are free to leave the webinar now. For those that are CPAs that want to join us for the next portion, we're happy to have you. And we're going to go ahead and get started. I know that we've had you all on here for a good amount of time. Mandy and I can both be fast talkers and kind of go through the CPA procedures kind of quickly. I see a lot of CPAs on here who've been doing it for a few years, and you might have questions about some new things so we'll just do kind of a review of the CPA agreed upon procedures at this time. So those agreed upon procedures test and report on the assertion of a business or qualified zone investor as to their qualification to receive the 2 EASY grants. It's reported in the CPA attestation report. It is required for all real property investment grants and for some or most job creation grants. And as Mandy mentioned, that exemption amount changed this year. The CPA must be independent of the company and currently licensed in Virginia or a state with reciprocity. And the CPA attestation reports must be received and submitted by April 1st, 2025 online. Findings must be reported on the required CPA attestation report forms. You can find them at the same link that's in the chat for the EASY portal. That form and the use of the forms have the support of the Virginia Society of CPAs. Do not retype the procedures or submit your findings in any other document than what has been provided by DHCD unless you have specific approval from us. And the attestation report forms for both grants are available, as I said at the beginning, with the EASY online submission system with the link in the chat. Reports submitted that do not state the findings for each procedure are considered incomplete. We're going to go over that a little bit more. The AICPA professional standards set forth state that the practitioner should report all findings from the application of the agreed upon procedures, and also specifies that a practitioner should avoid vague or ambiguous language in report findings. Examples of appropriate and inappropriate descriptions of those findings can be found within section AT 201.26. Based on the professional standards set forth, providing only your initials or the words "no findings" for each procedure does not constitute an adequate description of the findings. The application will be deemed incomplete. Here's an example. The CPA shall inquire of the source of all grant monies used to fund the qualified investment by obtaining management representation to determine that federal, state, and local source grant funds of public funds were not used to purchase items on the scheduled qualified investments. So the response should not be just your initials or no findings or no exceptions. It should say no grant monies were utilized for this project, or received 3,500 in local grants, the amount was subtracted. I always tell people that pretend like you're back in school and you're doing your homework. Restate the question in your answer, and you cannot go wrong there by providing more information. So just restate it so that we know that you haven't just gone through and written no findings or no exceptions for each one. So the submittal requirements are the same as we said before, 11:59 on April 1st. All have to be submitted online. Those that are incomplete or late will be processed after we process the ones that were on time. In the past, those had not been processed because of the lack of funds to process those extra applications. If you are submitting more than one application, then each application and the materials have to be submitted separately, even if it's for the same business or zone investor. You should get 3 application confirmations. One is successful submission. One is a notification from either Mandy or myself of any, or from the e-zone address of any deficiencies that may be present that need to be fixed. And then the third one will email you and let you know when those deficiencies have been resolved. So let's talk specifically about the real property investment grant, the CPA agreed upon procedures. So the applicant has responsibilities. We went over these during the RPIG. That's to give you all the information that you need as the CPA, including all invoices and receipts for those investments that were capitalized, and that final placed in service document issued for those completed investments. Other applicant responsibilities include next slide, there you go. The supplemental documents, that's for your mixed use buildings, owners of space within a building, or your tenants. We went over those earlier. And now we're going to talk about those CPA responsibilities. So the attestation should report the following. It reports that all required attachments are completed, including any supplemental documents that are necessary, that only qualified investments were included, so there are no unqualified or ineligible investments, and that all the costs listed were either capitalized or expensed by the zone investor. So again, that list excludes any investments that were funded from public grants from either federal, state, or local sources. And it also reports that the real property for which the investments was made was placed in service during grant year 2024. It reports, if applicable, for supplemental documents that mixed-use buildings have the square footage that are necessary to meet the mixed-use threshold, which is that 30% of usable floor space is commercial or industrial. And also, if the zone investor owns a space within a building or zone investors applying as tenants, they have the square footage that is accurate to indicate on the supplemental forms that they are also eligible and have coordinated with owners and tenants within that building. Procedure 1 is attestation that the application has been completed. The CPA will read the real property investment application and report that all required documents have been prepared and prescribed in the format, and that the applicant declaration form has been signed and completed. So number 1 is a completed and signed Commonwealth of Virginia W-9. Number 2 is a completed and signed local zone administrator form. Number 3 is a completed and signed applicant declaration form. And number 4 is a copy of that final placed in service document. Must have the same physical address as the address on application. If it doesn't, then you would make sure that the application has that spelled out in part 2 of that submission form. And approval or issuance of that final placed in service document must be within calendar year 2024. Number 5 is that there's a completed, signed, and notarized supplemental form for a mixed-use building, Form EZR PIG mixed use, if applicable. Number 6 is to confirm the same if a multiple owner form is necessary. And then number 7 is to ensure that a completed, signed, and notarized consent forms are present for a tenant owner consent or a tenant coordination situation if you have either of those. Procedure 2 is the attestation of the QRPIs. The CPA will read the itemized list of those investments as well as invoices, receipts, etc., to determine that only qualified investments are listed. You're going to make sure that all of those are your hard construction costs, interior, exterior, structural, mechanical, or electrical improvements, and that there are no soft costs or ineligible costs listed as part of those qualified investments. In the case of cost categories listed on the schedule that include more than one type of work, such as drywall and demolition, we require for a breakdown of the work included in the category by the CPA, and the CPA will read and ensure all the cost categories are in qualified investments. The CPA will report any items whose qualifications are uncertain, including the exact dollar amount of the corresponding investment submitted on the application. The CPA will compare the schedule of investments to the general ledger entries to determine that the items and costs listed on the schedule were charges to the appropriate capital asset account or expense account. The CPA will obtain and read 100% of the invoices, receipts, AIA reports, and any other relevant documentation of construction expenses. The CPA shall compare these documents to the dollar values on that QRPI schedule and report on whether the charges agree. The CPA shall obtain and read Part 3, which is that list of the QRPIs, and make sure that the contents are the same as the attestation report to determine whether the QRPIs reported on the application meet the applicable minimum investment threshold in those different investment categories. The CPA shall inquire of the source of all grant monies to ensure that no federal, state, or local grants are part of the funds used to purchase items that are part of the schedule of qualified investments listed. Procedure 3 is attestation of placed in service documentation. So for this section, the CPA will read that placed in service document that indicates that work is complete and up to code as evidenced by the date, and that the placed in service date indicates the calendar year which the zone investor applies for the grant, so 2024. The CPA will read to ensure that the placed in service document is final and that no other documentation was issued or is pending by confirming with the locality's building code office. In cases which the final place in service document was only for a portion of the building or facility, the CPA will read the investment amount to determine that it only includes work completed on the portion covered by that placed in service document, and that there were not other portions of the building or facility included as part of the investment that do not have final placed in service documents. When placed in service document is a final CO, the CPA will compare the physical address to the address on the application. The CPA will read the final CO to determine that the date of issuance is correct in calendar year 2024. The CPA will determine that it indicates that it was final, and that if it was a tenant of the building, that the tenant has a signed capital lease agreement and has coordinated with the building owner. The CPA will read the final CO to determine that the name listed matched on the that the name listed on the CO matches the name listed in that part of the application. And if not, then that's where you would list that again in Part 2, Section B of that application. If the final placed in service document is a final building inspection, you're going to do much of the same thing. If it is a case in where the building was in continual service and there was no change in use or final CO, you'll read that the final building inspection is at the physical address that matches the application. You'll make sure the date of issuance is 2024, it's final, and you'll also make sure that the name listed matches that of the application. If the final placed in service document is a third-party licensed inspector's report, it's all of the same checks that you're going to do. except for the third-party license inspector's report, you have to make sure that the locality did not require any building permits or other permits for any of those investments that are listed on the schedule. So you will need an official letter from the building code official to determine that it references the physical address and also states that those permits were not required for that third-party licensed inspector's report. Moving on to procedure 4, the attestation of square footage for mixed use buildings. This is to ensure that those mixed use buildings are eligible. The CPA will determine that the applicant has indicated mixed use and that they've provided that supplemental form. You will check that part 2 of the form has been completed by the preparer of the measure drawings or plans and submitted by the to the locality. You'll check that it contains the professional seal or notarized signature of the preparer, if not an architect. And if no formal drawings were required by the locality or the zone investor prepared their own, the CPA will determine that a licensed third-party architect or contractor has signed and sealed the form certifying that at least 30% of the usable floor space of the building is devoted to the commercial, industrial, or office use. And that happens frequently when the applicant is a developer. They may do their own drawings and plans, but they have to have that third-party architect or contractor to sign and seal that form. And then you will also check that part 2, box 4 is mathematically correct and at least 30% to qualify for the real property investment grant. Procedure 5 is attestation of owners of space in building. This is applicable if the building has multiple owners of a space or the facility does in terms of an office or condo situation. The CPA will determine that the square footage indicated in those closing documents or the deed of trust is accurate and is the same as the supplemental form. The CPA must determine that the zone investor has coordinated qualification with all of the owners so that we can make sure that there are not multiple applications and that they're not exceeding that maximum grant amount. The CPA will determine that the applicant has indicated owned space in a building and that they have that supplemental multiple owner form completed and signed, and will compare the form to any backup documentation provided by the applicant. So that includes closing documents or deeds of trust and report on those findings. Procedure 6, we're continuing procedure 5. The CPA will also determine that part 2, box 3 is mathematically correct to show that square footage. The CPA will determine that info in part 3 of the form agrees with the grant request by the zone investor. And this says on Form Easy RPIG, but that should say the online application or that sample application, indicating that the grant was either prorated or has been coordinated with all the other owners of that space in the building or facility. If it's a case of coordination of those grant funds, then the CPA will determine that all the building and facility square footage has been accounted for by all of the other owners' notarized signatures, so that the sum of the square footage when you add up each of the different building owners adds up to the maximum or total square footage amount. Procedure 6 is for the case of a tenant in a building that is applying for the real property investment grant. So when that applicant or firm is a tenant in a building or facility, the CPA will determine the square footage information indicated in the lease agreement is accurate and indicated on that supplemental tenant owner consent form. The zone investor must provide the CPA with access to that lease. And the purpose is to ensure that the zone investor has obtained the proper consent of the building owner and has coordinated qualification with any other tenants in the building. The CPA will determine that the applicant has indicated tenant in the building and that that supplemental form has been completed and signed and they've been provided with that valid lease that agrees with the information on that tenant supplemental form. The CPA will determine that part 4 and part 5 of the form have been completed, where the building owner gives consent to the tenant to apply, that part 3 is mathematically correct, and that the parts of the supplemental form agree with the grant requested by the zone investor. Moving on to, I thought we had one more procedure, but we have 6 procedures, and that is the complete part of the CPA procedures for the real property investment grant. I will take maybe a minute or so for questions because Mandy still has to do the JCG agreed upon procedures. So what questions do you have about those real property investment agreed upon procedures? Let's go ahead and move on to the JCG. It's saying we have 5 minutes left in the meeting, and I am not sure what that means for us.
Hopefully we'll be okay and be able to stay past 4 o'clock. Sorry, but just in case, I'll go ahead and go through these job creation grant attestation. We do just, we've reminded you a few times. We want to make sure you remember that CPA attestation exemption is changed so that, and what that means, that it's for base year employment of 100 or fewer permanent full-time positions that create 25 or fewer grant eligible positions. They are exempt. And again, the JCG grant worksheet must still be completed each year. The firm seeks qualification for the JCG regardless of whether the attestation report is required. So we reviewed these applicant responsibilities earlier, so I'm going to go ahead and just go past those and then go into the CPA attestation responsibilities. So they are structured to ensure that the company is not including personal service, food or beverage, or retail establishments, as such positions are prohibited from applying. And then the company only includes those permanent full-time positions in the base year and grant year, and that the wage rates for the net new equivalent permanent full-time positions in the grant year are accurately indicated on the worksheet. Also, that employment dates and wage rates for positions listed on that worksheet are accurate and identical to information on the payroll and personnel documentation. So procedure 1 for the attestation regarding prohibited positions, the CPA will read the NAICS code listed on the sample application, which is the Part 1, Box 5, determine that the code listed is one other than those ineligible positions listed here. If a business, just of note, if a business is not a retail business, but has retail positions, the firm is eligible for job creation grant, but only the positions that are not in retail. Food and beverage or personal service can be included. So sometimes a hotel may be included in this because they have a restaurant, they have a retail location, but they also have other employees. So something like that may be eligible depending on how it is structured. The attestation of permanent full-time positions on the worksheet itself. So the CPA will follow a sampling procedure explained below to obtain employment documentation and the worksheet for employees filling the permanent full-time positions during the base year and grant year. The CPA will report the applicable procedure that was used establishing the sample of permanent full-time positions. So there are rules for sampling for the CPA. Firms that have 100 or fewer employees filling those positions, the CPA will obtain a random sample of the documentation for employee filled permanent full-time positions on the worksheet and read to ensure the start and end work dates for such employees agree, without exception, to the information provided on the payroll records using that random sampling techniques. If there are 20 or fewer of those positions, the documentation and worksheet calculations for all employees will be included in that CPA sample. For firms with more than 100 employees filling those positions, the CPA will obtain a random sampling of payroll records and health benefits documentation for 20% of all employees shown. And the CPA will read to ensure the start and end work dates for each employee agrees, without exception, to the information provided using random sampling techniques. The random sampling will be based on the use of a table of random numbers, and the CPA will first assign each employee listed on the worksheet a unique identification number. Then the CPA will select cases for the 20 employees or 20% sample, whichever one is relevant based off of the information, when their identification number corresponds to the number chosen from the table. The CPA does need to indicate on the worksheet in column B which employees have been selected to be sampled. And the CPA will stop selecting cases when they've reached the desired sample size. If identification number is selected more than once, then the CPA will ignore the repeats. So any non-reconciled errors, should the CPA find any non-reconcilable errors, basically any unexplained differences between the information on the documentation provided and what is on the worksheet in that sample population, then the CPA should repeatedly select 20 employees or 20% sample from the original population until the subsequent sample produces no non-reconcilable errors. And the CPA shall submit by name any of those errors found during the procedure in the attestation report, except if the client chooses to revise the worksheet and application to remove those errors, then the CPA shall read to ensure that the revised worksheet has omitted those non-reconcilable items and that there are no resulting changes from the original worksheet. Procedure 3, the attestation of the required documentation. So for each employee from that sample population, the CPA is going to compare from the worksheet for the base year and grant year employment information listed to all of the required documents, which include the I-9, the first payroll and last payroll for base year and grant year, and health benefit enrollment information provided by the company. If a case of a business in a qualification year other than its first year, the sample should only include grant year information. So if the company is in year 2 through 5, then the sample from the CPA should only include grant year eligible employees, not base year employees. This is just procedure 3, continue the I-9. The CPA will obtain the I-9 to determine the base year and or grant year, employee's name, social security number, address, and that start date of employment. In a case where the I-9 was signed prior to the actual hire date, so for example, as part of the job application process, then the CPA will read and complete the I-9 in conjunction with the supporting employee payroll documentation and attest to the hire date for the employee listed on the worksheet. The CPA will obtain and review the payroll records for all of the employees for base year and grant year. That includes first and last payroll records for the time the employee worked during those base year and grant year. The CPA will compare the employee's name and employee number where assigned with the information included on the worksheet, read and compare all the records and attest that the first and last work date for each employee within the base year grant year correspond to those dates listed on the worksheet, and compare any wage rates as indicated on the first and last payroll records for those sampled employees hired in the grant year or net new employees with the specific wage rates listed on column O of the worksheet and report any differences. So just as a reminder, if the employee received raises or decreases in pay during the grant year, the employee must be listed on a separate line for each wage fluctuation. They do not use the average wage rate or ending wage rate. The CPA will read the worksheet and determine that the employee's wage fluctuations during that grant year have been listed on the spreadsheet as many times as the payroll records indicate that wage fluctuation. For sampled employees with information in the columns of P, Q, R, and S on the worksheet, the CPA will read the employment documentation, determine the employees reflected on the worksheet are permanent and full-time. If the sample employee's wage rate was converted from salary to hourly, the CPA determines that it is mathematically correct by dividing that annual salary, inclusive of shift premiums and commissions, by the 1,820 hours number. Procedure 3, continue the health benefits information. The CPA will obtain and read the signed health benefits enrollment agreements and compare insurance coverage materials indicating employer contribution to payroll documents, and indicating the employee contribution to make sure that that does meet the required 50% threshold. The CPA also should compare the individual employee information on these documents to the information presented in column N, indicating they are offered and received those health benefits and for which wages are listed. So as such employees are net new over the base year employment, and report any of those findings. And the CPA should report all instances where the firm does not offer to contribute to at least 50% of the cost of the health insurance premium. And again, that is an offer that can be declined by the employee. And this addresses that for employees filling grant eligible positions that have declined health insurance coverage, the CP will obtain and read the employee's signed waiver of health benefits. For firms that self-insure their employees' medical claims, a copy of the firm's policy signed by the employee with that has wages listed in column O is acceptable documentation. And if this goes back to the information. If a business does not make health insurance benefits available for permanent full-time positions until after a 90-day employment period, then the initial 90-day employment period during which benefits are not available can be included on the worksheet. The firm should list the first date and last date the employee filling the position met the wage requirement for those employees whose health benefits were effective after a specified employment period, provided they're offered by the start date. And we reviewed that earlier with a question, I think that was asked by someone, of their inclusion on the worksheets. And then procedure 4, attestation of the grant eligible positions with qualifying wage rates and health benefits. So the CPA will read the qualification information on part 2 of the online application or the sample application and compare whether that information entered corresponds correctly with the auto-calculated values, and that also corresponds with the worksheet where the job creation grant or the job information was listed, and be sure to indicate any discrepancies on that attestation report. So that was quick. It's 4:06. We if you have any specific or any additional specific questions right at this time, we'd be happy to take those. And I'm going to go ahead and just keep this slide up for just a moment with our contact information. You'll notice right here at the top, as Kate indicated, we do have an e-zone at dhcd.virginia, spelled out, .gov. That does go to both of us. And so if you have questions during this grant process, then we encourage you to send it to that email address, or you could copy us individually. But that is the primary point of contact to reach us, all three of us, to get the hopefully quickest answer as possible.
Don't see any questions coming in. Thank you everyone for being with us for the last 2 hours. We know it was long, but we hope that that means that it was thorough and that you got the information that you needed. And please feel free to reach out to us, as Mandy said, and we hope that you have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.